All right. So we ended last week with verse 12, which was a warning to the Jewish people not to enter into covenants, not so much not to enter into them, but to be careful who you enter into them with. And I mentioned last week that I think it could have saved the Jews a lot of trouble. Let me give you an example. In the first century CE, the Jewish leadership of the time, particularly among the Pharisaic leadership, not so much everybody, but Pharisaic pretty much covered everybody. The Sadducees were an offshoot of the Pharisees. The Essenes at Qumran were an offshoot of the Pharisees. In the Hasid movement, that's not mentioned by Josephus, because he only mentions the three, but the Hasids were also obviously there. I think that the Pharisaic movement was a split off from the Hasidic. Either way you look at it, all four of those groups, their belief system was very, very similar. And it was among the Hasids that they didn't worry as much about some of these things as the rest of the Pharisees did. For instance, the Pharisees did not allow Jews to do business with non-Jews. You couldn't purchase, for the most part, particularly foods, because you couldn't know for sure that they hadn't been sacrificed to idols and things like that. And since one person may do it somewhere in the world, nobody that's Jewish was allowed to do business with anybody. It didn't make any difference if they were your next door neighbor and you'd known them your whole life and knew they wouldn't lie to you, you still couldn't do it. So they would take things like that to these extremes, and when you take them to these extremes, you wind up with a lot of people around you that don't think very highly of you. And it caused a lot of tension between the Jews and the non-Jews. But the Pharisees of the Judean world, particularly in Jerusalem, took it even a step further. If you were a Jew born, raised, circumcised on the 8th day, but you were Hellenized and didn't speak Hebrew, they called you a Gentile, and they didn't do business with you. It didn't matter that you were Orthodox and that you lived according to the law of God and all that kind of stuff didn't make any difference to them. You didn't speak Hebrew as a first language. You were a Gentile. They wouldn't do business with you. So that a house divided against itself does fall, and they did fall. They lost their temple. They ultimately were driven out of their own country. I just think that when we start putting laws on top of God's laws and then decide that God's laws aren't worth anything, that man's laws that we wrote in place of God's laws are so far superior to God, we've set ourselves up as God. We no longer need the God that created everything. We are the God that creates everything. And that's the issue that the Hasids had with the Pharisees, because the Pharisees had begun to teach that the oral tradition far exceeded the written. And so the Hasidic movement just wouldn't go, the Hasids, I should say. It wasn't really a movement. It was a group of people that had been around for centuries. The Hasidic group, and by the way, they're nothing like today's Hasidics. These Hasidics live by God's law, by the written. Now the Hasids of today live by man's law and shun the written. And they tell you all day long that they don't. But this is the basis of Pharisaic Judaism of modern times. They have a New Testament, not the Christian New Testament, understand. They have the New Testament that was written in the Dark Ages by people who didn't even speak the Hebrew language, who were not trained rabbis, who did not know what they were talking about. They didn't recognize the simplest of Hebrew idioms. For instance, when the Bible says that God had a long nose, Onkelos dealt with that by changing the words. When he translated it, it no longer said long nose. Well, that would be okay if you wrote that God was patient. But Onkelos had no idea what it meant that God had a long nose. He just didn't believe God had a nose. God didn't have hands. God didn't have feet to walk on. God didn't have feelings. He didn't touch people. So since God didn't exist, apparently, and this is my problem with Onkelos, he literally took everything that was Jewish out of his translation. And this is what the sages of the Dark Ages built Judaism around. Something that did not and no longer existed. Something that was no longer connected to the Judaism of the biblical period. We still use them, we still talk about them, because every once in a while somebody like Rashi or even Ezra gets lucky and actually gets something right. And I point that out, but I'm spending a lot of time showing you how wrong they were, because they didn't know the simplest, just simple little idioms that, had they known them, Judaism might not be as lost as it is today. And Judaism is utterly lost in the darkness of their ignorance. The vast majority of it is. Why do I say that? Because the vast majority of them tell you there is no God. The vast majority of the Jews today tell you that they are atheists. So don't tell me that Judaism isn't lost and wandering in the darkness, because it is. We constantly are meeting people who are either Jewish or, like last night, dating a Jew. The girl was ashamed to even talk about it. There's something wrong here, people. At some point, we got to quit getting mad at Robert for pointing out the truth, and maybe start thinking, maybe we need to reconnect to the fathers of this religion, not to the people in the Dark Ages who knew nothing about this religion, not to Onkelos, who we lean on so heavily, who obviously knew he wasn't even Jewish. They have to tell you that he converted to Judaism, which there's no evidence of whatsoever. They have to tell you that to make it okay for us to accept his work instead of the Jerusalem sages, which, hey, I'm okay with not going with the Jerusalem sages. They were worse. We got to have something, right? We got to have, why not use the Hebrew? Why not throw out all of the Aramaic translations? I'd be okay with that. Any volunteers ready to follow me? Probably not. Anyway, so what the warning was last time was not that, it was not God telling us not to do business with non-Jewish people, nations, and companies. It was telling us that when we make our covenants with these people, we need to make sure that our covenants are such that these people don't lead us astray, such that our covenant with them doesn't become something that makes us more, makes our covenant with them more important than our covenant with God. That's all it was saying. We live in this world. We have to deal with the people in this world, the places and the things that go on in this world. We have to deal with those things. God was not telling us to run off to Qumran and separate ourselves from everybody and act like God was going to like us better than them. God is not a respecter of person. He never has. He never will be. We have somehow found favor in the eyes of God in that he made a covenant with us. Not because he went around and offered it to everybody else and they all rejected him. That is Jewish folklore, and it's nonsense. It would make God stupid because he didn't know who was going to make a deal with him and who wasn't. Come on, God knows it all. But we made a deal with him, and God signed on the dotted line knowing that we were going to break our deal with him. So there must be something about us that God finds important to him. There's something about us, about mankind, that God is very much in love with. He finds value in us as people, but he's asking us if we are going to live in his presence, if we are going to walk before him, because see, that's what's messed up. We go around trying to make our own God that will walk before us. That's what the whole golden cow story was about. And you think, oh, well, that was a story from forever ago. No, it's not. It's a story about how you and I live our lives every day. It's a story about every human being who's ever walked the face of this planet. We all have a tendency to want to make a God that will serve us rather than us serve the God who created everything. So we need to go back to the actual Hebrew texts and forget about what the translations say. Now, we're going to do a lot of translating here because my audience, for the most part, doesn't speak Hebrew. So it would do me no good to talk to you in Hebrew because there would be no one listening that would understand it, right? Anyway, don't know why I went off on that. Kind of wish I hadn't. We're beginning today in Shemot, which is also known as Exodus. We are in chapter 34, and we begin with 13. Literally in English, and I mean this is just the most literal translation you could get, for altar them you shall make destroyed, and monuments them you shall shatter, and groves his you shall cut down. And anywhere it says his, it can be the word it. So we start off with ki, which is for or because, and then the word et, which is just, it doesn't even have a meaning. It's just kind of a pointer. It points you in a direction. Then it says mitz bechotam. Maybe you hear mitzvah in there somewhere. The altar. So we literally, that's altar them or altar their, Their. Their altar is the way we say it in English. And it's an altar. It's a place where you have burnt offerings. Maybe you have incense. There's incense altars as well. There's the golden altar that was within the temple, the incense altar. But you get the idea. This is the altar. So it's their altar. Remember, we're talking about when we're entering into covenants and we're going into this land that belonged to these non-Jews, if you will, Judaism is not a bloodline. This is another one of those things that just drives me up the wall. Israel is in grave error over this one. They will allow people to be in their government that hate all Israelis and want all Israelis dead, but they will not allow Christians to become Jews because of the Jesus thing. Oh, this bothers me. Judaism, and they don't even accept DNA stuff, but what's funny about it is they believe that they have they can tell you whose DNA, whether you come from Isaac, Benjamin, or whoever, they think they can tell you that. As if somebody has the DNA of Isaac and somebody has the DNA of Benjamin and on and on. As if they have that and could actually do it. Judaism has never had a bloodline, ever. The father of Judaism, Abraham, was a Chaldean, not a Jew. Not a Jew. When the Jews left Egypt, the biblical text in Hebrew tells us that it was a mixed bag of people. They were from every color, race, and creed. So the idea of chasing down the black Jews that ran off into Africa, that came back up this week, and that drives me up the wall. Because I don't understand, for one thing, as a white guy, I do not understand why black people need to have something special. I'm white. I don't have anything special. I don't know what this is. Why do you have to have some kind of special connection to the black Jews? Judaism isn't black. It isn't white. It isn't brown. It isn't yellow or any other color. Judaism is a religion. It is the religion that God gave to mankind. If you want to be connected to something that goes way back, connect to the religion of Judaism, because from its beginning, it did not have a bloodline that was pure in any way, shape, or form. You had a Chaldean who was also married to a Chaldean. Their kids were Chaldean, which basically you're looking at the Arab world there. Well, anyway, his concubine was Arab at least. But Moshe, we know that he came from the line of Abraham, so he was Chaldean, not Jewish, Chaldean. He married a black woman at some point. Whether he divorced his first wife or not, don't know. It doesn't say anything about what was going on with his first wife. Just out of the blue, he marries a black woman, and it caused a big rift. Why? Because all the white Jews hated black people? No, because it was the black people that had enslaved these non-black people for 400 years. The Egyptians of the ancient world were black. And they were literally black. Their skin was literally black. They were the very, very dark, not mixed with any other race black. And so you had probably none of them leaving Egypt with the children of Israel, as they're called. Probably none of the Egyptians left with them. But you did have black slaves. They would not have been Egyptian. They were of the other tribes that had fought against the Egyptians, lost, and became enslaved, because that's what the Egyptians did. They would win a war and make the people who survived their slaves. Even the Jews did that. I mean, that was something everybody that conquered did back then. But you had black people. Otherwise, who did Moshe marry? I'm just throwing that out there. But you had black people. You had people from every nation known to man in that place. Now, does that mean there were American Indians? Nope, they weren't there. Were there people from India? Most likely. Were there people from China? Most likely. Italians? Not likely. They didn't exist. Romans? They did not exist. So there are, groups of people that were not in existence at the time. But of the nations of the world, this would have been a pretty heavy representation. And I don't really think anybody from Egypt, an actual Egyptian, would have been among those people. But it is possible, though not probable. So you had all these people from all over the place, from every nation, color, and creed, leaving that place together. Not fleeing to Egypt, but fleeing from Egypt. I don't want to go into much more than that, with this teaching of people trying to find some kind of identity. Our identity is not found in our skin color. Our identity as Jews is found in our religion. Otherwise, we're not Jews. The word Jew comes from the word Yehudi, Judy. Hear the word Judy? Like my mother's name? That means little Jewish girl. But they used to call him Judy in Germany. That's how they pronounced Jew, was Judy. And if you notice, it's spelled Judi on the yellow stars. And they pronounced it Judy. Some pronounced it Yudi. I don't know if that was regional or what it was, but I've heard it both ways in those old films. The word Yehudi comes from two words in Hebrew that were mixed together. The first one, the Yeh sound, comes from God's name. The second one is Hud, which means imitator. So, imitator of God. Are you getting it? How do you become an imitator of God? Well, it used to be that every Jew knew that if you lived according to God's written law, you were a Yehudi. You were an imitator of God. Because you used to know back in the day, way back in the day, that God lived by the Torah. When he gave the Torah to us, that's the reason why it was called the grace of God, the Torah is because God was gracious enough to say, well, this is how I live. Let's write it down. You don't kill, you don't steal, you don't commit adultery, you help your neighbor get his ox out of the ditch, blah, blah, blah. Here you go. That's why it's called the grace of God. The law is called the grace of God. Because God gave us his lifestyle. If it works for him, it'll work for us. I'm just throwing that one out there. But when we live that way, we are called Jews. Thus, the religion of Judaism. It's more than religion. It's a lifestyle. We live this lifestyle of of not lying one to another, this lifestyle of not cheating one another, this lifestyle of being faithful, this lifestyle of spending time with our God, of spending time with our family, being people that can be depended upon. That's what makes us Jewish. That's our heritage. That's what we pass on. And it has no color to it whatsoever, which is a good thing, because if you go back 2,000 years, most of the people that were Jewish were brown, and I'm not brown, just saying. I wouldn't have a heritage, right? I have the heritage because of the fact that I follow God's law. That's what makes me Jewish. That's what gives me that heritage, what gives me that past. It has nothing to do with the color of my skin. Otherwise, I'd be in trouble. Anyway, let's move on. So when you get to this place where you're with these people who do not live the way God lives, it's not about what they look like. It's not about the color of the skin. It's about these people who are living where they shouldn't be. They built towns and houses and farms in a place where they shouldn't have done it. It wasn't their land in the first place. They took it by violence and took it by force. I'm sure the first inhabitants probably didn't have to, but after that, it went down that road. So when you get there, first thing you're going to do, you're going to see that altar, and then what are you going to do to it? Well, it says Titot Zoom. You're going to destroy it. You're going to make it history. You're going to tear it down. Does that mean that it's the job of every Jew to tear down every church they see and tear down every mosque? No. This was when the Jews enter into the land that's given to them by God. This is what they're going to do to the temples and all that are standing. By the way, there'll be nobody there worshiping in them. They'll all be gone. God promised already that he's going to drive them out. He didn't murderize them. He didn't kill them. He no doubt took care of them because God is a just God. He didn't just drive them out. They had somewhere to go. God gave them somewhere to go. What that is, we don't know. But we know God is just, and that's what he does. So anyway, but when you get there, you're going to destroy this stuff. You're not going to leave it there and say, well, it's a historical marker, and it's history, and we can't just destroy it, right? Nope, you're going to destroy those altars. And Ma Zivotam, and their monuments. You know, those statues that they put up that celebrate things that are against God's law. You're being told that's what you're going to do when you get there. You're going to tear those monuments down. This is Tesha B'Harun. You're going to shatter their monuments. You will shatter. He's using these words in a way that you know that they can't be glued back together. You know what I'm saying? You got to make sure these things are utterly destroyed. This is Ve'et, which is and, Asheriv, and its groves. And he's talking about the land that God's given to the people, the groves that are in the land. This is the word Asherah. Asherah. You've heard that word before? It's a statue, image of Asherah, made of wood, a wooden pillar of great size. And they give an example in Judges chapter 6, verses 25 through 27. It says, which on account of its height was fixed or planted in the ground. And Asherah, or statue, of this sort stood near the altar of Baal at Samaria from the time of Ahab. And they give 1 Kings, so you can go look at that if you like. There's all this stuff. You can look at the Jacinius if you like under this word. What was that number? If you get one of the newer Jacinius, you can look under number 842. Anyway, then our next word is Tiherotun. You shall cut down. So they're these pillars that were either planted or buried in the ground. It's hard to say, and I'll read some stuff about that here in a minute. But you're going to cut it down. So the translation, for you will destroy their altars, and you will shatter their monuments, and the groves of Asherim you shall cut down. Kasuda wrote, the Asherim were cultic objects made of wood, which were apparently named after the Canaanite goddess Asherah, and represented and symbolized her or her fertility. It is not possible to determine their form. By most scholars, they are considered to have been tree stems or wooden posts that were set up next to the altars. Seeing that the entire passage here, speaking in general terms and not with reference to the worship of sacrifices of deities, it appears that the word Ashrim in this verse does not denote images of the goddess Asherah, as several exegetes have supposed. So he went in a circle. In the beginning, he's saying that's what they are, and by the time you get to the end of it, he's talked himself out of it. The truth is, nobody knows. But I think there's a hint right here in America. There's a place, I think it's in Kentucky. Don't quote me on that. But they call it, it's not Stonehenge, but like Stickhenge. Somebody will have to Google this. Woodhenge, maybe it's Woodhenge. But anyway, they found this place, and it was an Indian, American Indian religious site, if you will, and they just had posts that went in the ground in a big circle. And those posts were lined up with the stars and stuff like that, and they could determine from those posts by the shadowing that came down when it was time to plant, when it was time to harvest, on and on and on. They used it to watch the stars, the same as Stonehenge. You guys can look that up. But anyway, they were posts, tall posts in the ground all the way around. And they've actually put the posts back in the ground. But I don't know how they figured out that it was posts. It was written in some document they found that was among the Aztecs that talked about it or drew it out or whatever. That's how they knew. And they found the place where, right here in America, it's several places where this has been done, but this one's been excavated. And they put the posts back down. You can actually drive to the place and see this kind of thing. It's going to be along those lines. It's the same sort of thing. They had the sticks up there for some reason. Nobody knows if they were carved and had designs in them or if they were just sticks in the ground. Nobody knows. Anyway. Verse 14, literally in English, for not you shall bow down, mighty hero, other for Yahweh zealous, name he God zealousy. This one's really important. This one has sent literally millions of people into the darkness, just in our time alone. It starts off ki, which is the Hebrew word we would translate as if, for, because. Then it says lo, that's the negative article, that's the word for no or not. Then it says tish ta have, for you will not bow down. You will not bow down, to sink down, to be depressed. It's to bow your head, right? To bow down. You will not bow down. Le'el, to El. El is translated as God all the time in the Bible. It does not mean God. It means mighty hero. It's a hero. It's a heroic person. They called Nebuchadnezzar El. They called many other people El. Not because they were calling them God. They were calling them El because they were heroes, or because they were kings, or the nobility. You could be the biggest coward on earth and still be called El if you were the king. Right? I mean, that happened probably a lot. But anyway, so it means strong or mighty hero. You will not bow down to their heroes. You won't bow down to, because heroes basically are what we would think of in our world as gods with a little g. Then it says acher. That means other, O-T-H-E-R. Then it says ki, for. Then it has the proper name of God. We say Yahweh. It's the closest we're ever going to get to pronouncing it. We know it's not right, but we know it's as close as we can get. Then it says Kana. For Yahweh is Kana. He's jealous, man. And this is terrible what's happened here. You look in places like the Gesenius, and it's their fault. It's the Strong's Concordance. It's his fault. You know, it's the fault of people westernizing something, people not knowing what they're dealing with, writing things down that are incorrect. We put the word jealous to it, and what do? Jealous. God becomes petty and jealous. Worse yet, he becomes petty. Now, if you bow down to some other god, God becomes petty and he's angry and he's going to punish you, maybe even kill you because you worship some other god. Does that really sound like a God you'd want to serve? No. And this has been one of the things that has led people into darkness. Oprah Winfrey told her story. She went to a very popular church. It was a large one, and if you didn't get there early, you were not going to get a good seat if you got in at all. It was popular. So I don't know where it was. I'm sure she said, but I don't recall. She goes into this place. She gets herself all set up in a nice seat up toward the front, and that preacher pulls this verse up. And he tells her that God is jealous. And she said it hit her. Wait, jealous? Why would God be jealous of me? What do I have that he can't have or doesn't have more of? What have I ever accomplished that's better than anything he's accomplished? You know, and these were legitimate questions for somebody who was just told that God is jealous. But kana does not mean jealous and petty. It means zealous. God is zealous. He is zealous on his people. He gets excited about people who love him enough to keep his commandments. He gets excited and he gets zealous for their cause. He gets in there and you know, he's like, cheerleader, go, you're doing it. No, get up, you're all right, get up, get back on the path. No problem, you can do it. You can do it. You knew that was coming, right? He's zealous. Shemo, that's his name. His authority. God's authority, El, is mighty. He's a strong hero, and it's zealous, to burn with zeal for any person or thing. When followed by a lamed, it's to be zealous for anyone's cause. Of course, this one wasn't followed by a lamed, was it? No, because it's followed by Shemo. I don't buy that. I don't think you have to have the lamed. The lamed just points to something. And that's why it says, when followed by a lamed, it's zealous for anyone's cause. Come on, you know good and well after what I just said, God is zealous for the cause of his people. Don't even think for a minute he's not, because he is. But he's a zealous God. He's a zealous hero. And then, of course, it ends with who he is, speaking of God. So your translation is, for you shall not bow down to their, and I put in brackets and squiggly words, you will not bow down to their fake little gods. You will not bow down to their fake little gods. For Yahweh, whose authority is zealous, he is a zealous God. Man, I wish people could see God for who he really is and not do that kind of thing, because that moment in time in that woman's life sent her on a 20-year-long odyssey looking for answers, and she found them in all the wrong places and led millions into that darkness. And that's probably just one small example of how many people have done something along those lines. Is she going to burn in hell for what she did? No. You know who's in trouble? That preacher. That's his fault. That's on him. Because our book, if we can read it in the language it was written in, very clearly tells us that the average Joe is not supposed to be behind a pulpit telling people what this book means. You're supposed to be well trained. You're supposed to be able to read it in its original language. You're supposed to be able to understand the idioms, the word plays, the poetic passages. You're supposed to recognize those simply by reading it. You're supposed to know it well. And then when you get up and teach it, you teach people that God is zealous, that he's excited about his people. You don't teach them that he's petty and jealous and run millions of them off into the darkness. The pastor's in trouble, not Oprah. Just throwing that out there. Onkelos changed the words to say idols instead of gods, even though the Hebrew Bible tells us not to add to nor take away from the text. By the way, this is a Hebrew idiom. Not to add to nor take away is idiomatic for do not change a thing. Onkelos was worried that the text written by Moshe would lead people to think that there might actually be other gods. You know what? There are other gods. If there were not, God himself would not have made a law against serving and or bowing down to and worshiping other gods. Yes, there is only one God with a capital G. In other words, there is only one real God with the power to create something out of nothing. But, there's always a big but. That does not mean that there are no fake gods to whom people attribute real power, real ability, and real attributes. They're still fake, but they are gods. They are heroes in the minds of those who choose to believe in them. Of the words, he is a zealous God. Tragically, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, Sepharno, God knows how many others, because of them, untold thousands of others have connected the idea of kana with the more modern jealous. They saw God as petty and small-minded, though they would never have ever admitted to it. God is not petty and jealous, exacting punishment on those who bow down to fake gods. He does not call fire from the heavens on those who would give the credit of his power to some stick or stone. God is, however, zealous for the cause of those who love him enough to keep his commandments. Verse 15, lest you shall slaughter covenant to dweller, the land and unfaithful they after gods them, and slaughter they to gods them, and called to you, and shall eat you from slaughter them. This is very important. We're on the same subject. Nothing has changed. So it starts off with the word pen in Hebrew. We would spell it P-E-N in English. Pen. It means lest. L-E-S-T, lest. Tiherot, lest you shall slaughter. Yeah. You don't do these things. Why? Because you're probably going to wind up cutting up an animal, putting it on the barbecue, making a covenant. Berit is your next word. So called from the idea of cutting, since it is the custom in making solemn covenants to pass between the divided parts of the animal. Have I ever told you about that? They would cut up the animals, and then the person who was making the covenant was called the stronger partner, because that's the person who initiated it, not because they had some power of greater, some position of greater power or something like that. They were just called the stronger partner because they initiated it. The weaker partner was the one who accepted it, right? And it's all it meant. So when they call the woman the weaker partner, it did not mean that the man was superior to the woman and she was weaker in the flesh than he was. Because there are marriages out there where the woman could just beat the tarnation out of her husband because she's stronger, right? The woman opens the can of pickles instead of the man. I'm just saying that does exist. It always has. It's not about that. It's about the one who initiates, the one who does not initiate, which in the biblical world, the man always initiated the marriage ceremony. And so that's why the woman was called the weaker partner in a marriage covenant, not because she was weaker in any way. Anyway, the stronger partner, the initiator, would pass between the animals, and if that person, male or female, made no difference. If that person was excited about the covenant, they would literally reach down, scoop up the blood, and just kind of wash themselves in it. Now, we're going back a number of thousands of years here. It's a long time ago, because the customs changed over time because it was so gross and nasty, and anyway. But if they were excited, that's what they would do. So when they passed through, then the weaker partner would pass through secondly. And it was just showing that they both are in agreement, right? And so the weaker partner would pass through, and if that person, male or female, made no difference, if that person was excited, that person would scoop up that blood and smear it all over themselves. And this act was called being washed in the blood. Are you washed in the blood? If you're Christian, you know exactly what I just said, right? If you're Jew, you're like, I know he's getting at something, but no, the Christians know about this because they sing songs about being washed in the blood all the time. That's where that came from. And there was a significance to it. What it symbolized was, may the same thing happen to me that happened to that animal if I break this covenant. That's why the punishment for sin, that's not how they put it. I'm trying to remember how the Christian Bible said it. The something for sin is death. You know what I'm talking about? The wages of sin is death, because the covenant with God is a blood covenant, isn't it? God, remember, there was all the sacrifices, and half the blood was spread on the altar and half the blood was spread on the people. So the wages of sin, breaking your covenant, was death. And that's what they were talking about, because it was Jewish rabbis writing. Just saying, just throwing that out there. But anyway, so we're seeing that this covenant this is a life and death thing. If you break this covenant, death was on the line. So anyway, what God's saying is, yeah, there's going to be a pretty good probability that you're going to cut a covenant with these people. Then it says, let Yoshev, with the dwellers of this land, Haaretz, Vezanu, and unfaithful they, to commit fornication, attributed to men and women who break a marriage covenant. In other words, they're unfaithful to each other. I'm going to put it that way to make it less intense. There's, under number 3, it says, the prophets used this word for those Hebrews who, after entering into the marriage union with God, this, you say, come into my heart, I'll live your way, and you be my God, and all that. After they did that, they chose to worship idols, used in the expression to go a-whoring after. That's kind of a King James thing, but you find that in Jewish writings because they used to write like that as well. That comes out of the 12th through the 1500s, the Queen's English and the King's English and all that. To go a-whoring after, of those who follow after idols and or imitate the actions of the non-Jews. This word goes beyond that of idol worship. It is the idea of giving the whole heart to another, so much so that consequences do not matter. I believe I got that out of the Jacinius as well. You can look it up, 2181. Anyway, our next word is ahare, so it's after. So it's to go whoring after, if you will, to be literal. Elohim, they're gods. They're heroes, the people they hold in high esteem, not just actual gods. Then it says vezahu, and slaughter they, and then it's not just that you slaughter a covenant with them, right? This is what God's afraid of. You slaughter the covenant with them, and then they go out and they slaughter an animal, lelohehim, to their gods, right? So now they've gone out and they've slaughtered. You can see why the Pharisees went this way, right? Because they're like, well, but what if? So they're worried about what if they've done this because of this verse. Then it says, ve kara. And then they call out to you. They've gone. You're unaware. You don't know what they're doing. They're out their place and they cut up this animal and they said, "Oh, mighty stick, we're slaughtering this to you, you great and mighty stick, or stone or whatever." And they've done all of that, and then hey, hey, Rob, come on over. We got the barbecue pumping out some good meat. I'm like, yeah, buddy, I'm on the way. Then it says, lecha, they call out to you, ve'ahalta, and you eat it, right? So you should be pretty clear about what you're not supposed to eat. Food sacrificed to other idols. Then it says, mizahu, from their slaughter, you eat from their slaughter. So our translation is, lest you slaughter a covenant with the dwellers of the land, and they are unfaithful. It's not about your faithfulness, it's about them being unfaithful. And you go after their gods, because that's what he's saying, and slaughter to their gods, and they call to you, I left out they, and you eat from their slaughter. So it's not that you go after, well, I think it's saying you go after their gods. Yeah, that's right. And it should say they slaughter to their gods and they call to you. So I didn't quite get that right. Yeah, I know you can't see it, but I'm trying to make sure I'm reading it right to you. So what, because this is an important distinction. Lest you slaughter a covenant with the dwellers of the land, you're making a deal with some company that, they're going to provide you with something that you need so that you can sell your product. And so you've made this deal with them, or you're buying from this store, you're buying from that store, whatever the deal is. You're dealing with people that are not following your lifestyle. They're not living according to your life, but you've made this deal with them. And it says, and you go after their gods. Now, he's not saying you have decided that you're going to go over here and worship their gods. No, he's saying that. Let's put that off to the side. And they slaughter to their gods, and they call to you, and you go eat that food that they've slaughtered to their gods. If you do that, you are going after their gods. So it begins to start to make sense why the Perushim, why the Pharisees were so adamant about this. They're like, you don't know what they've done. You don't know that they haven't cooked pork all over their grill, didn't clean it, put their food on it. Now you're getting the pork, right? You're going after their gods. You don't know that they didn't go out and cook all of that stuff and worship it, and put it on a plate and say, here, we give this to our stick god, our rock god, or whatever god. And then they come back over here and they're feeding it to you, right? So the Pharisees are like, you don't do business with them, period. Well, that's not what God said. God said you got to be careful about it. You got to know what they're doing. You got to ask. That's why one of the rabbis from that period wrote, you have to ask. Now, when it's translated in English, it's saying, don't ask. That's just rude. No, what the guy wrote was, you got to ask. You got to know where it's coming from. So he's with God. He's going with what the written says. The written says, be careful. Ask questions. Make sure that they're not cooking your steak in a vat of pork grease. Make sure they're not cooking your fried chicken in their vat of pork grease. Or, what you follow what I'm saying? You have to ask. Rabbi Shaul ben Gamliel said. But the Pharisees were like, don't even go there. Okay, well, you can do it either way, but it cost them Israel. So I'm always saying to people, do it God's way. You go ahead and you make these deals because they're advantageous for you and for these people. But you got to be careful. And that's all God was asking. Of the words, and they are unfaithful. Kasuda wrote, the verb zana, to commit fornication, connotes here idol worship, due to the concept that the relationship between Israel and God is similar to that between a wife and her husband. And consequently, the worship of idols is a form of harlotry. of the words eat from their slaughter. Rashi wrote that eating foreign sacrifices was the same thing as giving authenticity to the idol. He went on to say that eating these sacrifices would lead to intermarriage, an idea found in the biblical text and also spoken of in the Babylonian Talmud under Avodah Zarah 8a. He is given a real example. I don't think he's exactly right, but it did happen, so he's not exactly wrong either. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, Casuto pointed out that there is a change from plural to singular, which he said was common in biblical style and was not to be regarded as evidence of a different source. Because there's this thing that started years ago about there's the J source and the I source and the E source, and they're trying to say that the Torah, as we know it, was written by several different people and it's just all been melded together. No, it hasn't. It has not. This is not good scholarship. This was just some wind of doctrine that some guy threw out there and tons of other people jumped on that bandwagon, and everybody went over the cliff together because it's not real. Casuto has spent a lot of time. If you've been listening to me any amount of time, you know that Casuto spent a lot of time arguing against that, and he knew what he was talking about. All right, well, we don't have time for anything else today, so we'll have to stop here and pick up with 16 next week. Shalom, y'all.